On August 13, 2018 in the quiet town of Frederick, Colorado, Chris Watts kissed his wife Shanann goodbye, dropped his two young daughters Bella and Celeste off at daycare and left for work. It seemed like just another ordinary day. But by the evening the picture-perfect family he had built would be shattered forever. When Shanann's friend arrived at her home later that afternoon, it was clear something was wrong. There was no sign of the family, no calls or texts, and the front door was unlocked. What followed would uncover a twisted and horrifying truth. Chris Watts, the man who had vowed to protect his family, was now the key suspect in a crime that would shock the world. What really happened in that house? What drove a father to kill his pregnant wife and their two daughters in the most heartless way possible? Tonight, we explore the story behind the Watts family murders, a chilling crime that leaves us with more questions than answers. Stay with me as we unravel the truth, piece by piece, of the terrifying night that turned a family's dream life into a nightmare. The Watts family appeared to have it all. Chris, a mechanical operator at an oil company, and Shanann, a vibrant saleswoman for a health supplement company, seemed like the perfect couple. They had two beautiful daughters, Bella and Celeste, and were expecting a third child, a son named Nico. On social media, their life appeared idyllic: vacations, family milestones, and Shanann's radiant posts painted a picture of a loving family living the American dream. Shanann, with her ever-optimistic posts, was especially active online, documenting every moment. From the announcement of her pregnancy to family outings, it seemed as though she was constantly sharing how lucky and happy she was. She even posted a heartfelt tribute to Chris, thanking him for being a wonderful husband. But behind those perfect photos, the reality wasn't as flawless as it seemed. Chris had been married to Shanann for 6 years, but their relationship had started to show signs of strain. Their once happy marriage was now marked by tension, and whispers of Chris's growing distance from Shanann began to surface. Shanann, despite her bubbly exterior, had her own set of worries. She had recently become concerned about their financial struggles. Their home, their cars, even their lifestyle were all purchased through loans, and they were facing mounting debts. But was this enough to explain the cracks in their marriage? Was financial stress the real reason for Chris's behavior? Or was there something else at play? And what about the affair that would later come to light? Chris had become involved with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker he had met at Anadarko Petroleum. They exchanged secretive texts and calls, and it seemed as though Chris was planning a life with her. Could a forbidden relationship really be the cause of the destruction of his family? Or was there something darker festering beneath the surface? What did Chris really want, and what was he willing to do to get it? As the Watts family went about their seemingly normal life, their darkest secret was about to surface. And on that fateful day, everything would change. But how could a man who had vowed to protect his family destroy the very people he promised to love? What would drive Chris Watts to commit the unthinkable? The answers lie just ahead. Stay with me as we piece together the shocking truth that led to the tragic murder of the Watts family. It was a typical morning on August 13, 2018, when Shanann Watts, a 34-year-old mother of two, returned home from a work trip to Arizona. After a long flight, she arrived back at her suburban home in Frederick, Colorado, just after 1 a.m. Exhausted but excited to be home, she shared a quick update on Facebook to her friends and followers. Shanann was a woman who often posted about her family and life, keeping the world up to date on her daily activities. But what no one knew, not even her closest friends, was that this would be her final post. She had been away for a few days on a business trip, and her family, her two daughters, Bella and Celeste, were eagerly waiting for her return. Chris Watts, her husband, had also been home that night, but by the time Shanann stepped through the door, he was already fast asleep, or so she thought. Shanann had made plans to meet a friend later that day, a woman named Nicole Atkinson, who was worried because she hadn't heard from her. As the hours passed, no one could reach Shanann. By the time Nicole arrived at Shanann's home that afternoon, she immediately knew something wasn't right. The front door was unlocked, Shanann's purse was inside, but no one answered when she knocked. Her car, with Shanann's phone and personal items still in it, sat parked outside. There were no signs of a struggle, but something was off, something far more unsettling. Nicole, alarmed and unable to get any responses, called the police. When officers arrived, they found Chris Watts' truck parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of Shanann or the girls. The investigation was launched immediately. The police began combing through the house looking for any clues. Yet, everything seemed calm, like a regular family home, except for one glaring detail: Chris Watts was nowhere to be found. At first, Chris appeared distraught, pleading with the police for help in locating his wife and daughters. He told investigators that he had no idea where they had gone. He even gave an emotional interview to local news, expressing how worried he was for his family. "I hope they're okay," he said, looking into the camera, his voice shaky. The whole town was watching, and what they saw was a father and husband in distress, desperate for answers. The mystery deepened. But the police weren't buying it. They had noticed inconsistencies in Chris's story, and they began to suspect that he wasn't being entirely honest. During a search of the house, detectives found something odd. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms, nothing that pointed to an intruder. The scene didn't match the story Chris was telling, and they began to question his actions. Why wasn't he more involved in the search for his wife and daughters? Why was he so calm, almost detached, in the face of such a tragic situation? Hours later, Chris was brought in for questioning. His demeanor, though seemingly normal at first, began to show cracks under the pressure. Detectives pressed him on his whereabouts that morning. What had happened between the time Shanann returned home and the moment she vanished? Chris stuck to his story, claiming that nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But as the hours passed, investigators started to suspect that the answers they were looking for lay within Chris himself. Could he have been hiding something? Could a man who was supposed to protect his family be the one who tore it apart? Chris's story started to unravel further when he was asked to take a polygraph test. He agreed, a move that seemed strange given the circumstances. And as the machine began to record, the truth that had been buried for so long started to surface. The results were clear. He had lied. His heart rate spiked and his body betrayed him. In the face of overwhelming evidence, Chris could no longer keep up the facade. What had he done to his wife and children? It wasn't until later that night, after being confronted with inconsistencies and further evidence, that Chris Watts finally broke. His confession would send shockwaves through the entire nation. But the question remained, what exactly led him to kill his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters? Was it an affair? Was it financial problems? Or was there something darker at play? The investigators would soon learn that Chris Watts wasn't just the man who had killed his family, he was a man who had planned it all. And as the details began to emerge, the public's perception of Chris as a grieving husband and father would be shattered forever. What was the real motive behind this horrifying crime? And how far would Chris go to hide the truth from the world? Stay with me because what came next was even more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into the disappearance of Shanann Watts and her 2 young daughters began almost immediately. On the morning of August 14, Shanann's friend, Nicole Atkinson, grew concerned when she couldn't get in touch with her. She was supposed to have been picked up for an appointment, but there was no sign of Shanann. When she arrived at the house, it was clear that something was wrong. The front door was wide open, but there was no one inside. Shanann's car was parked in the driveway and her purse, phone and keys were all still in the home. But the most unsettling discovery was the phone call Nicole made to Chris Watts. Chris, who had been at work that morning, was informed by Nicole that something was off, and he rushed home. When he arrived, he too noticed the strange absence of his family. The house was eerily quiet. The police were called and the search began. The fact that Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child only intensified the urgency of the investigation. It didn't take long for the authorities to start questioning Chris, who was acting more distant than anyone expected. At first, Chris seemed to be genuinely concerned about his wife and daughters. He spoke with local news outlets, pleading for their safe return. "I just want my family back. I don't know where they are," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. But something didn't sit right with investigators. His demeanor seemed strangely calm, and his behavior was inconsistent. His emotional state didn't match the severity of the situation. The police began their investigation by searching the house, but there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. Everything appeared normal except for the strange feeling that was slowly creeping in. The house seemed frozen in time. Shanann's bags were packed for a trip, her medication was left behind, and her cell phone lay on the kitchen counter. It was as if Shanann and the girls had vanished into thin air. As investigators continued their search, they turned their attention to Chris. The first thing they did was review his movements and timeline. And that's when things started to get odd. The footage from the neighborhood surveillance cameras would be a key piece of evidence. The footage captured Chris Watts leaving for work at 5:27 a.m. as he'd told everyone. But something stood out. It was a strange, almost robotic movement as he loaded his truck, no sign of the usual morning rush. He didn't seem frantic or worried. He looked entirely calm. But it wasn't until later, when the police examined the footage closer, that they noticed something chilling. At 1:48 a.m., the time Shanann returned home from her business trip, Her phone pinged, showing her location at the house. She had made a few attempts to reach Chris by text, but her messages had gone unanswered. This timeline didn't add up. Chris claimed he had no idea where his family had gone after he left for work, but investigators weren't buying it. Days later, the case took a major turn when Chris agreed to take a polygraph test. The results were conclusive. He was lying. Under pressure, Chris eventually admitted to something that no one could have ever imagined. What had he done to his family? The shocking truth was far more disturbing than anyone could have guessed. But what was it that made Chris Watts snap? Was it his growing affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, whom he had met just months earlier, or was there something more? What pushed a seemingly normal man to commit such an incomprehensible crime? Could there have been signs leading up to that moment? And what did the authorities uncover next? What they found would make the world question everything they thought they knew about Chris Watts. The police uncovered text messages and phone records showing that Chris had been in contact with Nicole Kessinger during the days leading up to the murders, and his secrets were slowly coming to light. But this wasn't just about an affair. There were deeper, darker layers that Chris hadn't fully acknowledged. How could someone who had been trusted to protect his family be capable of such a horrific act? And why did he do it? As Chris's confession unraveled, the chilling details came to the forefront, details so grotesque that they shook the core of every person involved in the investigation. The pieces were falling into place, but the most chilling moment of all was yet to come. How did Chris justify the murders of his own daughters? What did he say about their final moments? And most disturbingly, what made him think it was okay to discard their bodies in such a cold and calculated manner? As the investigation continued to unfold, a crucial breakthrough happened. Police learned where Shanann and the girls had been disposed of. They weren't just missing, they were already dead. In a haunting twist, Chris Watts led investigators to the Anadarko petroleum site, where his work as an operator had given him easy access to the tanks. What they found inside those tanks was beyond comprehension. The remains of Bella and Celeste were found in separate oil tanks. Shanann's body was buried nearby in a shallow grave. Each of them had been brutally murdered, and their bodies were left to rot in the same oil field where Chris had worked. But the question remained, why? What was going through his mind when he made those decisions? How could a father kill his children and his pregnant wife with no remorse, only to show up to work as if nothing had happened? In the next chapter, we'll dive into Chris Watts' legal proceedings and explore the psychological aspects of this horrendous crime. What led to his plea deal, and what has he revealed about his actions since being incarcerated? How has the world continued to react to the Watts family murders, and what have we learned about the man who took everything from them? Stay with us as we continue to uncover the layers of this tragic story. As the days passed and the investigation into the Watts family's disappearance continued, the truth began to unravel. Chris Watts had confessed, but his admission of guilt was far from the whole story. What led him to murder his wife, Shanann, and their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste? And how could a man who had once seemed so devoted to his family commit such a horrific act? At first, Watts claimed his wife had killed their daughters and in a fit of rage he murdered her. But when investigators dug deeper, it became clear that Watts' story was crumbling. How could someone who had spent days pleading for the safe return of his family suddenly reveal the darkest of secrets? What twisted lies had he built around his life? On August 15, 2018, just 2 days after the bodies of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were discovered, Watts was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with 2 counts of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, as Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their unborn son, Nico. He was also charged with multiple counts of tampering with a deceased human body. It didn't take long for the legal proceedings to take shape. On November 6, 2018, just months after the tragedy, Watts pleaded guilty to all charges. But his plea deal was not a simple one. By pleading guilty, he avoided the death penalty, which the prosecution had initially intended to seek. Was that a fair deal? Or was it a case of the prosecution wanting to avoid the emotional and public toll of a lengthy trial? The decision to plead guilty stunned the nation. Why would a man like Chris Watts, someone who had shown no sign of remorse during the initial investigation, choose to confess? Was it to protect himself from the death penalty? Or was it because he knew he could no longer hide behind the lies he'd woven for so long? In the days that followed, the courtroom was filled with media, legal experts, and a stunned public, all eager for any hint of why a seemingly normal family man would commit such a crime. The Watts case had captured national attention, and the legal proceedings would be no different. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would serve his time at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. As the gavel came down, the courtroom fell silent. The families of Shanann and the children were there, devastated, but somehow relieved that Watts would never again be a free man. However, as the sentencing took place, one chilling thought lingered in the minds of those in the courtroom. What really went on inside the mind of Chris Watts? Did he truly feel any remorse, or was this simply a man trying to save himself? In the months that followed his conviction, Watts began to communicate more. He wrote letters to various people, including his own family. Was he trying to find a way to atone for his crime? Or was he simply playing a part in a story he had no intention of ending? His letters to the media and his confessions to prison staff were studied for any sign of genuine remorse, but some reports suggested something far darker. Chris Watts wasn't just guilty of murder. Some experts believe he was hiding the full truth about the horrific crime. But how deep did this twisted deception run? What else was he hiding from the world? One of the most shocking twists came from a letter Chris Watts wrote in early 2019. In it, he expressed regret not for killing his family, but for the way his affair with his mistress, Nicole Kessinger, was exposed. This letter revealed that, in his eyes, the betrayal of his family had not been his primary regret. Could there have been more to his motivations than anyone realized? And what about the moments just before the murders? Experts began to pore over Watts' behaviors, his relationship with Shanann, and his growing affair with Kessinger. Was there an underlying tension in the Watts marriage? How far was Chris willing to go to start a new life with his mistress? But here's the most unsettling question of all. What was Chris Watts' true motive? Was it the affair? The financial struggles? Or was there something far darker buried deep within him that even he couldn't understand? As the world tried to piece together the fragments of Chris Watts' life, there was one chilling fact everyone could agree on. The public still didn't know everything. Despite his confession, despite his guilty plea, Chris Watts had yet to reveal the full extent of his actions, and the true horror that occurred behind the closed doors of his home. So what happened in those final moments just before the lives of Shanann, Bella, Celeste and Nico were brutally cut short? Were there signs of the rage he had concealed? Or had it been something far more calculated, with Watts coldly plotting the murders months in advance? With each new detail that emerged, the Watts case continued to haunt the public. The true nature of Chris Watts' actions, and the lasting impact on the family left behind, remain a subject of fascination and fear. Will the truth ever fully come to light? In the next chapter of this story, we'll examine the aftermath of the murders, the media frenzy, the public's thirst for answers, and the legacy of one of the most disturbing family annihilations in American history. But before we go on, ask yourself, could someone like Chris Watts ever truly be sorry? Or is there something more chilling behind those empty words of regret? The morning after Shanann Watts and her children were reported missing, the town of Frederick, Colorado, was gripped by uncertainty. But the horror of the situation was just beginning to unfold. As police launched their investigation, Chris Watts's calm demeanor struck many as odd. He had been the picture of a concerned husband and father, pleading publicly for the safe return of his wife and daughters. But behind closed doors, the investigators were beginning to piece together a different story. Hours after Chris's televised plea for help, police had already started to dig into his statements. They were noticing discrepancies, small but crucial details. Chris initially told police that he had last seen Shanann before he left for work at 5:15 a.m., but surveillance footage from the neighborhood contradicted this. Shanann had arrived home late the previous night, around 1:48 a.m., after a business trip. She had posted a Facebook video of herself excitedly telling her followers about the pregnancy reveal. But there was no sign of Chris being the caring husband he claimed to be. Why was he so composed in front of cameras while his family was missing? As the investigation ramped up, Chris's story began to unravel. Police obtained a search warrant for the Watts home and began analyzing his phone, computer, and bank records. They also gained access to Shanann's social media accounts, where everything appeared flawless, a happy family enjoying life. But the cracks in Chris's marriage were evident in private messages. It was soon revealed that Chris had been having an affair with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger, for several months. The affair, however, was not what ultimately led to the tragedy, but it was the catalyst that set the deadly chain of events into motion. What role did the affair play in Chris's decision to murder his family? Was it truly the tipping point, or was there more to it? On August 15, 2018, police confronted Chris with the truth. His story didn't add up. The evidence was overwhelming. The final nail in the coffin came when Chris failed a polygraph test. Under intense pressure, he finally broke. "I didn't want to do this," he confessed. but I felt like I had no choice. Chris revealed a disturbing truth. The night of the murders, Shanann came home from her business trip, but she was not alone. She had been 6 weeks pregnant with their third child, a son they had planned to name Nico. That evening, Chris claimed Shanann confronted him about his affair. He admitted that she had been furious when she found out about it, leading to a heated argument. But what he described next would shake the investigation to its core. Shanann, in his version of events, had reacted emotionally, and it seemed he couldn't control his anger. Chris told police that after their argument, he strangled Shanann to death in their bedroom. But that wasn't the end of the horror. He went on to describe how Bella and Celeste, his 2 young daughters, had witnessed the aftermath. In his chilling confession, Chris said that when Bella saw her mother lifeless, she asked him, "What happened to Mommy?" He told investigators that his daughter had struggled when he tried to smother her with a pillow, her small body fighting for its life. But eventually he smothered Bella. Next he moved to his youngest daughter, Celeste. With Bella and Shanann already dead, Chris claimed that Celeste was the easier target. He suffocated her with a pillow in the same cold, calculated way. His daughters, in the blink of an eye, had been taken from the world. Why had he taken it so far? Why kill his children? Why smother them, slowly, methodically, in their own home? What happened next was almost unimaginable. After taking the lives of his entire family, Chris loaded their bodies into his truck and drove to the Anadarko petroleum site where he worked. There he disposed of their bodies in 2 large oil storage tanks. Shanann's body was placed in one tank, while Bella and Celeste's small bodies were dropped into the other. It was only then, after the killings had been completed, that Chris called his employer to report that he would not be coming in for his shift. What made him think he could get away with such a horrifying act? Why did he go to such lengths to conceal his crime? When authorities discovered the bodies, the gravity of the crime set in. The community, which had once viewed Chris as a loving father and husband, was now shaken to its core. How had someone so close to the family, someone who was supposed to protect them, become the monster behind it all? The case soon captivated national and even global attention. People across the world were left horrified, asking, how could a father kill his own children? And why? For Shanann's family, the aftermath was unimaginable. They had lost their beloved daughter, Shanann, and their 2 granddaughters in the most brutal way possible. The grief was almost too much to bear. Shanann's family was heartbroken, and her mother, Sandra Rzisek, would later say in an interview, "I lost a daughter, 2 granddaughters and a great-grandson, in a moment. And I don't know how to process that." The media frenzy around the case was unprecedented. News outlets, documentaries, and books began to cover every facet of the case. Chris's confession, his apparent lack of remorse, and the investigation itself. The public followed every step of the case, from Chris's plea to the eventual discovery of his guilt. In November 2018, after a brief court appearance, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all charges against him, including 3 counts of first-degree murder and unlawful termination of pregnancy. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would serve his time at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Despite his confession, many questions remained unanswered. Was Chris truly sorry for his actions, or was his remorse just another act of manipulation? Why did he think he could escape the consequences of his crime? What was going through his mind when he ended his family's lives, and why did he choose to end it all in such a horrific manner? The case left a lasting scar on the community, Shanann's family, and even those who followed it from afar. For many, the Watts family murders were a tragic reminder of how quickly things could unravel. A perfect family, seemingly unscathed by the world, torn apart by a single act of violence that no one saw coming. As time passed, Chris Watts's prison letters began to surface, offering small glimpses into his psyche. In them, he continued to express regret over the murders but also hinted at deeper, darker thoughts that he hadn't fully disclosed during his trial. Was Chris Watts ever fully accountable for what he did, or did he leave more of the story untold? And with that, the public's fascination with the case continued as the unanswered questions loomed, about the man who took the lives of his own children and wife, about what drove him to commit such an act, and whether anyone will ever fully understand the chilling truth behind the Watts family murders. Chris Watts seemed like an ordinary man, a loving husband, a devoted father, and a hard-working employee. He had built a life that many would envy, a home, a family, and a future. But behind the facade of normalcy, something far more complex was unfolding. To understand the depths of this tragedy, we need to look into the mind of Chris Watts and what may have driven him to commit such unspeakable acts. Was this a crime of passion? At first glance, many might think of this as a crime of passion, an impulsive act triggered by anger or betrayal. But the reality is much darker. Chris's confession revealed a carefully calculated plan. He didn't just snap in a moment of rage. He methodically carried out the murders, even pretending to search for his family when they were already gone. The affair and his desire for a new life. Chris was involved in an affair with Nicole Kessinger, a colleague at his job. Their relationship had been growing in the months leading up to the murders. In fact, Chris had been planning to leave Shanann and start a new life with Nicole, whom he had fallen in love with. But there was a problem. Shanann was pregnant with their third child, a son they had named Nico. How could he leave his family behind? It's easy to see how an affair could lead to emotional turmoil, but is it enough to explain such extreme behavior? Chris's actions suggest something deeper at play, something that goes beyond just wanting a fresh start. Financial stress, a pressure cooker. Financial strain is often cited as a contributing factor in crimes like these. Chris and Shanann had been facing mounting debt. They were living beyond their means, and Chris was struggling with the pressure of providing for a growing family. It's possible that the weight of their financial struggles contributed to his decision. But was this the only factor, or did it serve as just another excuse to justify his actions? The Watts family home was filled with consumer goods, but beneath the surface they were living paycheck to paycheck. Shanann was an independent woman who worked hard in her direct sales business. But Chris, who had a steady job in the oil industry, was not making enough to ease the financial burden. Could this frustration have driven him to a breaking point? Chris's view of his family. Shanann had documented their lives on social media, presenting a picture-perfect family life to the world. But in reality, the marriage was struggling. Chris felt suffocated by his role as a husband and father. He had grown increasingly distant from Shanann, and as time went on, his resentment seemed to build. But there's a key question. Why would he go so far as to murder the very people he had once loved? Chris's apparent indifference during the investigation, his calm demeanor, and his willingness to manipulate the situation to his advantage suggest that his feelings toward Shanann and the girls were more complex than we initially thought. Could it be that he saw them as obstacles standing in the way of his escape from the life he no longer wanted? The fact that Chris murdered his daughters in such a cold and methodical manner suggests a profound detachment from reality, a man who could no longer emotionally connect to the people who were supposed to mean the most to him. It wasn't just an act of violence, it was an attempt to remove his responsibilities entirely. The Family Annihilator, a psychological profile. Experts who study familicide, the killing of one's own family, have noted that there are specific psychological traits that many family annihilators share. They often exhibit a sense of entrapment, financial distress, and a desire to control the family dynamic. Chris Watts fit this profile in chilling ways. According to criminologists, family annihilators often view their family members as possessions, extensions of themselves, and not as individuals with their own needs or desires. It's possible that, in Chris's mind, his family had become obstacles to his happiness. Their existence threatened his new life with Nicole, and to get rid of those obstacles he felt that he had to eliminate them entirely. This type of psychological detachment is one of the most disturbing aspects of the crime. Chris didn't show visible signs of remorse during the investigation. When he first spoke to police, he even expressed more concern about the fact that his family was missing rather than the fact that they had been murdered. This initial reaction gives us a glimpse into his mindset. He was more worried about how the situation would affect him than about the lives of his family. The role of narcissism. A key aspect of Chris's personality that emerges in the wake of the murders is his narcissism. Narcissists often prioritize their own needs and desires over everyone else's, and they struggle to empathize with others. Chris's affair and subsequent murder of his family could be seen as an extreme form of this narcissistic behavior. Narcissists often create an idealized image of themselves, and when that image is threatened, they may go to great lengths to protect their ego. For Chris, the idea of losing his family while pursuing a new romantic relationship might have been intolerable. It's possible that he saw his family as an impediment to his self-image and that his desire to be with Nicole became so consuming that he no longer saw his family as real people, but rather as obstacles to be removed. Psychopathology, lack of empathy. It's important to consider whether Chris Watts displays traits commonly associated with psychopathy. Psychopaths are known for their lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and willingness to manipulate others for personal gain. Chris's calm demeanor during the investigation and his calculated actions, including strangling his wife and daughters and disposing of their bodies, are characteristics often associated with psychopathic behavior. Did Chris's lack of empathy play a role in his decision to kill his own children and wife? When he spoke about Shanann, he showed little emotion even when recounting the details of her death. The same goes for Bella and Celeste. Chris showed no visible remorse for ending their young lives. Could this cold detachment indicate a deeper, more ingrained psychological disorder, or was it simply the result of the pressures he was facing in his personal and financial life? The moment of confession. When Chris finally confessed to the murders, he painted a picture of a man who had been pushed to the brink by his circumstances. Yet, the more he spoke, the more he seemed to rationalize his actions, downplaying the brutality of the murders and justifying his need to start over. This lack of true remorse suggests a man who was still operating in a psychological state where his own desires outweighed any sense of guilt or responsibility. It's important to ask, was this moment of confession a genuine admission of guilt, or was it merely a calculated move to minimize the consequences of his actions? By confessing, Chris may have believed that he could reclaim some sense of control over his narrative. He controlled the story, he was the one telling it, not the investigators. As we peel back the layers of this tragedy, the question remains, could anyone have seen the signs? Could Shanann have known what was happening beneath the surface? Or was Chris Watts simply a man who, in the pursuit of his own desires, lost all sense of morality, compassion, and humanity? The chilling truth may never fully be revealed, but this case serves as a stark reminder of how the darkest secrets can lie hidden in the most ordinary of lives. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to the murders, the psychological profile of Chris Watts began to emerge, painting a disturbing portrait of a man whose facade of normalcy masked a deeply troubled inner life. Chris Watts, on the surface, appeared to be an ordinary family man. He worked as an operator at an oil company, had a home in a suburban neighborhood, and was married to Shanann, a woman with whom he had 2 young daughters. To many, their life seemed perfect. Shanann frequently posted about their seemingly happy family on social media, showing off vacations, birthdays, and family outings. But beneath this carefully curated image, there were cracks forming in Chris's marriage and, more disturbingly, in his own psyche. Chris had been having an affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, someone he had met at work. The relationship was intense, and Chris was eager to start a new life with her, one free from the responsibilities of his marriage and family. The affair was the catalyst, but it wasn't the sole reason for the tragedy. It exposed deeper issues of resentment and dissatisfaction that Chris had been harboring for months, if not longer. The dissatisfaction with family life. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Chris's behavior had become more erratic. He was distant from Shanann, and their relationship had grown cold. Though they had appeared happy on the surface, they were facing financial struggles. Shanann had recently started a new job that required travel, which kept her away from home more frequently, and Chris had begun to feel the pressure of maintaining the family's finances. But beyond these stressors, there was also a sense of emotional detachment growing in Chris. He was unable to express his dissatisfaction with his life, and instead, he sought solace in his affair. This new relationship with Nicole Kessinger became a means of escape, a way for him to fantasize about a life where he could be free from the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage. Psychologists who have analyzed Chris's case often point to his apparent lack of emotional empathy and an inability to properly process his feelings. Instead of facing his problems head-on, he seemed to have buried them, ultimately making the unthinkable decision to rid himself of the very family he once claimed to love. The act of murder, a calculated decision. When Chris Watts murdered Shanann and their daughters, it wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of rage. It was calculated. Chris had been planning it for weeks, and on the morning of August 13th, he set his plan into motion. The decision to kill his wife and children, including their unborn son Nico, was deliberate. Chris's actions show signs of a man who had been mentally rehearsing the crime. In the early hours of that day, Chris smothered Shanann as she slept in their bed, likely as a way to silence her. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their son Nico, and yet, there was no hesitation in his actions. According to Chris's confession, he strangled Shanann with his bare hands, ultimately ending her life while she was unconscious. He then loaded her body into his truck and drove to a nearby oil site, where he dumped her body in a shallow grave. Afterward, in one of the most chilling parts of the crime, Chris murdered his 2 daughters. Bella and Celeste, who were still asleep in their beds, were smothered with a blanket, one by one. In his confession, Chris described how Bella had fought back, begging for her life as she was killed. Celeste too died in the same brutal way. What stands out most about this is not just the horrific act itself, but Chris's lack of visible emotion during the process. There were no signs of emotional turmoil or regret immediately after the murders. He drove to work as though nothing had happened, and went about his day, lying to law enforcement and even pleading for the safe return of his family. In his mind, the plan to be with Nicole Kessinger had begun, and everything else, his past life, was disposable. The motive, escape and rebirth. Experts believe Chris's motive was not merely about infidelity or escaping an unhappy marriage, it was about control. In his mind, killing his family was the only way to free himself from the suffocating ties of responsibility and the expectations he had placed on himself. The affair had offered him a new path, a chance to rewrite his future. But in order to do so, he had to eliminate the obstacles standing in his way. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were just obstacles in his eyes. This is a phenomenon known as family annihilation, where the perpetrator kills not only their spouse but also their children. In cases like this, the killer often feels trapped by family obligations and seeks a way out. They might not view the murder of their children as an act of cruelty, but rather as a means of severing ties to their past and starting anew. Chris's inability to express or confront his dissatisfaction, combined with his desperate desire for freedom, culminated in an act of horrifying violence. His actions suggest a deep emotional disconnect from the victims, even though he had shared years of his life with them. The absence of guilt or visible remorse, both during the murders and afterward, points to a disturbing lack of empathy. A psychopath or a man at the edge. Was Chris Watts a psychopath, devoid of emotion and driven solely by his desires? Or was he a man pushed to the brink, struggling with emotional and psychological turmoil that manifested in a horrific impulsive act? Many psychologists lean toward the latter, citing Chris's behavior in the aftermath of the murders. His calm demeanor and ability to function in the hours following the deaths suggest a complete emotional detachment from the enormity of his crime. Yet, his actions, planning the murders, lying to investigators and later confessing in a desperate attempt to avoid a trial, reveal a man who was far from emotionally stable. He could not handle the complexities of his life and resorted to the extreme measure of ending it all. Some argue that while he might not have been a psychopath, his lack of emotional regulation and his inability to cope with his problems in a healthy way led him to make the ultimate choice. What we can learn from Chris Watts' actions. Chris Watts' case is a chilling reminder of the dangers of emotional suppression, the consequences of unchecked frustration, and the darkness that can lie hidden behind a well-crafted facade. It also underscores the psychological complexity behind crimes of this nature. Unlike many other murders, family annihilation cases don't fit neatly into traditional categories of motive. They are not simply the result of anger or hatred, they are driven by a twisted desire for escape, a need for control, and a frightening lack of emotional connection. For the family members left behind, the aftermath of the murders is devastating. Shanann's family, especially her mother, has repeatedly expressed their grief over the loss of their loved ones. The murder of children, especially in such cold blood, is a crime that reverberates far beyond the immediate victims. It haunts entire communities and challenges our understanding of human nature and the depths to which some individuals can sink. Ultimately, Chris Watts' psychological profile reveals a man who was deeply disconnected from his emotions, driven by a warped sense of necessity and entitlement. His actions will forever serve as a dark example of what can happen when someone becomes so detached from their humanity that they are willing to destroy everything they once held dear to achieve a fleeting moment of personal freedom. The Watts family murders quickly became one of the most talked about cases in recent memory. What began as a missing persons case turned into a media frenzy, capturing the attention of millions. News outlets, social media platforms, and streaming services alike were captivated by the horrific details and the stunning revelations that followed. At first, the public believed the story of a devoted husband and father whose family had suddenly disappeared. Chris Watts' emotional pleas for their safe return were broadcasted on television, and the community rallied around him. But as the investigation unfolded, shocking contradictions began to surface. Watts' seemingly sincere public appeal was in stark contrast to the grim truth that investigators were uncovering behind closed doors. As the details of the crime became public, media outlets began to scrutinize every aspect of Chris Watts' life. His affair with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger, was revealed, adding a new layer of betrayal to an already tragic story. The public's view of Watts shifted from a grieving husband to a cold and calculating murderer. The narrative of a loving family man, so carefully crafted through social media and public appearances, crumbled in front of the world. The case soon became a media spectacle. Every new detail was dissected in interviews, analysis, and documentaries. The investigation, Watts' confession, and the emotional statements from Shanann's family were plastered across news outlets. The Watts story had all the elements of a high-profile case: deception, betrayal, and an unimaginable tragedy that sparked national outrage. It wasn't long before the true crime documentary community took notice. One of the most notable representations of the case was the Netflix documentary American Murder: The Family Next Door. Released in September 2020, it provided a haunting look into the Watts family's life leading up to the murders. Using Shanann's own social media posts, home videos, and text messages, the documentary painted a picture of a woman who was trying to hold her family together despite Chris's growing emotional distance. It revealed the eerie irony of her upbeat social media posts, which were posted just hours before her life, and her family's, was tragically cut short. The documentary's raw and unfiltered approach, combined with Shanann's real-time posts, resonated with viewers on a deeply emotional level. It wasn't just a case of murder, it was a glimpse into the lives of a family destroyed from within, masked by a facade of normalcy. Critics and viewers alike were drawn to the psychological elements of the case. Chris Watts' behavior before, during, and after the murders was analyzed from every angle. How could someone capable of such brutality appear so normal on the surface? Was this a man driven to the edge by external pressures like financial strain or infidelity? Or was this an act of pure, calculated malice? The public's reaction to these portrayals was mixed. Some felt a deep sense of empathy for Shanann's family, who had to endure the public spectacle of their loved one's death being dissected by the media. Others were horrified by the insensitivity of turning such a personal tragedy into entertainment. Nonetheless, the media coverage helped to shape the ongoing conversation about the motivations behind familicide and the ways in which intimate relationships can unravel into violence. By the time the story had been covered in every possible medium, from podcasts to YouTube documentaries, it was clear that the Watts family murders had become a cultural phenomenon. It wasn't just about the deaths of Shanann and her daughters, it was about how they had been hidden behind a perfect family image, only for the darkness to eventually be revealed. In the years since the crime, the Watts case has remained in the public eye, with ongoing discussions on social media and true crime forums. The tragic events continue to be a topic of debate. Was Chris Watts a monster, or was he simply a man who snapped under the pressure of his own lies and desires? The media and the public seem unable to let go of this disturbing story that defies any easy explanation. Through documentaries, news specials, and endless articles, the Watts family murders remain one of the most chilling and widely discussed true crime stories of the past decade. As the story of the Watts family tragedy unfolded, the world was left with a haunting image of the man who had once been a devoted husband and father, now convicted of unimaginable crimes. But where is Chris Watts now, and what has become of him since his sentencing? Following his guilty plea on November 6, 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of his unborn son, Nico. He was sent to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, a maximum security facility where he would begin his life behind bars. Inside prison, Watts' behavior has been scrutinized. Initially, he claimed he had no idea why he committed such horrific acts, but as time passed, his story began to shift. He confessed in letters and interviews, later telling authorities that he had been struggling with his emotions and was overwhelmed by the desire to escape his family life, which he described as draining. Despite offering these explanations, his narrative still leaves many unanswered questions. In prison, Watts has remained largely isolated, undergoing extensive mental health evaluations. Some reports suggest that he has found solace in religion, regularly participating in Bible studies. But even with these attempts to rehabilitate himself, the families of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico will never get the closure they seek. They continue to live with the heartbreak of the lives lost. Outside prison, the impact of the Watts case continues to reverberate. Shanann's family, who had long suspected something was wrong, have dedicated themselves to keeping her memory alive. They speak out on behalf of Shanann, her daughters, and their unborn son, using their platform to raise awareness about the dangers of domestic violence and to share the story of a family who had once been so full of hope, only for it to be brutally extinguished. The public's fascination with the case remains intense. Documentaries, including Netflix's American Murder: The Family Next Door, have brought the case back into the spotlight, reigniting discussions about Chris Watts, his motives, and the disturbing details that were revealed during the investigation. New theories and speculations continue to emerge online, as people try to understand the mind of a man who committed such an unthinkable act. For Chris Watts, the story is far from over. As he serves his sentence, his case continues to be a chilling reminder of how something as ordinary as a suburban family can be shattered by the darkness hiding beneath the surface. And for Shanann's family and the public, the search for answers, no matter how unsettling, still lingers in the air. As the case continues to haunt those who knew them, we're left to reflect. Could anything have been done to prevent this tragedy? Or was it all just a matter of fate? The Watts family murders remain one of the most chilling reminders of the darkness that can sometimes lie beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. If you've ever wondered what drives a person to commit such a horrifying crime, this case may offer some of the most unsettling answers we'll ever have. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.